Marijuana History 101, or should I say extremely brief Marijuana History 101. It's big, complicated, and we'll only be able to scratch the surface. So let's get started. The first thing that strikes one as odd when looking at the history of marijuana, which is also known as cannabis, is how very much legal it once was. In fact, it wasn't only legal, it just happened to be one of the largest agricultural crops in the world, including the United States. You see, cannabis can also be hemp. And just what is hemp?
Well, it's by and large the most robust, durable, natural soft fiber on the face of this planet.
Up until 1883, and for thousands of years before, cannabis hemp was the largest agricultural crop in the world. It had thousands of uses and products. The majority of fabric, lighting oil, medicines, paper, and fiber came from hemp. The first marijuana law to exist in the United States was a law ordering farmers to grow hemp. Benjamin Franklin used it to start one of America's first paper mills. The first 2 copies of the Declaration of Independence were written on cannabis hemp paper. Up until the 1800s, most of the textiles in the United States were made with hemp. 50% of medicine marketed in the last half of the 19th century was made from cannabis. Even Queen Victoria used the resin extracts from cannabis to alleviate her menstrual cramps. But the funny thing about industrial hemp was you couldn't get high from it. Yet, it was lumped in with the following, which also made little sense. Reefer madness. In the early 20th century, yellow journalism had surfaced. Articles depicted blacks and Mexicans as frenzied beasts who would smoke marijuana, play devil's music, and heap disrespect and viciousness on the readership, a majority of which happened to be white. Some offenses included looking at a white woman twice, laughing at a white person, or even stepping on white men's shadows. And this ended up leading to a law in the form of a tax stamp. A tax stamp that would not only include marijuana, but also hemp and cannabis medicines. It's speculated that hemp's potential for an abundance of new products was going to be in direct competition with other sources. And this, added to the reefer madness, led to the eventual downfall of all forms of cannabis. Popular Mechanics magazine had actually prepared an article entitled New Billion-Dollar Crop. Hemp was touted as being able to produce more than 5,000 textile products from its thread-like fiber and more than 25,000 products from its cellulose, ranging from dynamite to cellophane. Its superiority as a source for paper was also becoming known, especially with the development of hemp processing equipment. Now, the new Marijuana Tax Act was all fine and dandy, except for one thing. If you wanted to grow hemp, you needed to buy a stamp, but they weren't giving any out to anybody. And so, in effect, all forms of cannabis became illegal. Things pretty much stayed that way until World War II, when the government decided that hemp once again was a good thing and produced a video, Hemp for Victory. But by the time the war was over, hemp again became bad. And in 1948, when the marijuana law once again came into question, Congress recognized that marijuana was made illegal for the wrong reason. It didn't make people violent at all. It made them pacifists. The communists would use it to weaken America's will to fight. Congress now voted to keep marijuana illegal for the exact opposite reason they had outlawed it in the first place. And all through the years, report after report, commissioned by everybody, from the mayor of New York to the president of the United States, has come back with the view that marijuana should have no criminal penalty attached to it. Yet, marijuana remains as illegal today as it did nearly 70 years ago.
Marijuana. It's become big business. A multi-billion-dollar business, both in Canada and the United States. But why has it become such a big business? Here in British Columbia alone, it's speculated that the illegal BC marijuana trade brings in upwards of $7 billion annually. And up to 85% of that product heads south to the United States. Having become an international issue, when do the lines blur? How does a massive underground market like this survive while remaining illegal? Why is marijuana illegal in the first place? And if prohibition is meant to protect us, I guess the most obvious question is, does the prohibition work?
If prohibition worked, okay, if you could just wave a magic wand and say, this has gone away, I'd be all over it, you know? But the fact of the matter is that prohibition has never worked.
You know, we've been here before. You remember the first prohibition, right? Which was?
Prohibition of alcohol.
No, I'm talking about the first prohibition. Thou shalt not partake of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And who was the big cop? And how many people did he have to watch? 2.
What are the goals of this prohibition?
I assume the goals of prohibition are to reduce the amount of drugs available and to reduce the demand for those drugs. In both instances, cannabis prohibition's an utter failure.
Has the prohibition stopped people from using marijuana?
You get a phone call and says, I'm from the federal government. I want to know whether you've been using cocaine or marijuana recently. Presumably, you might be getting a little bit of an underestimate.
In 1937, there were estimated to be 55,000 marijuana users. And now there are estimated to be more than 50 million of them. That's a 100,000% increase.
Seems to be quite a few of them.
Yes, I'm afraid there are.
Whether the drug is criminalized or decriminalized does not affect the rates of smoking of cannabis, either uptake or of discontinuation.
So what are the dangers of using marijuana?
I don't know.
I don't know.
Gives you like a rapid heartbeat.
Smoker's cough.
I'm sure it has some effect on your brain function, memory.
I don't know, is there something unhealthy about moving slowly?
It's not good for you.
You're not fully conscientious of what you're doing.
Thickens some membranes in your brain or something.
Well, it's been science. I guess I'm being told it's been scientifically proven that marijuana kills your brain cells.
That's the one I remember. Marijuana kills brain cells.
I thought the same thing. You know, I didn't start smoking pot until about 5 years ago. I thought pot made you stupid. You know, I bought into it just as much as anybody did. I realized when I was like 30 years old that I was tricked. I was like, you gotta be fucking kidding me.
1974, the Heath Tulin study. Ronald Reagan announces, the most reliable scientific sources say permanent brain damage is one of the inevitable results of the use of marijuana. Monkeys pumped full of marijuana, apparently 30 joints a day, had begun to atrophy and die after 90 days. Brain damage was determined after counting the dead brain cells of both monkeys who had been subjected to the marijuana and ones who had not. This study became the foundation of the government, and other special interest groups claim that marijuana kills brain cells. Here's what they didn't tell you. After 6 years of requests, how the study was conducted was finally revealed. Instead of administering 30 joints a day for 1 year, Dr. Heath used a method of pumping 63 Colombian-strength joints through a gas mask within 5 minutes over 3 months.
They suffocated the monkeys. What they did is they put these gas masks basically on their face and they pumped pot into it, but without additional oxygen. So after X amount of time, the brain shut down. Well, if you suffocate, the first thing that's going to happen is your brain cells are going to die with lack of oxygen. So what they did is they suffocated the monkey, showed all these dead brain cells, and then went on to associate it by saying that cannabis use causes your brain cells to die. And how many people, not knowing the origin of the study, have gone on to quote it and re-quote it. And now people believe it.
Studies since have shown no signs of any brain cell damage. In 2005, new research suggested that marijuana could possibly stimulate brain cell growth. That study hasn't received the same attention. Another common belief? Marijuana causes lung cancer.
In the 1999 study by the Institute of Medicine that was paid for by the United States government, they had to use words like may and should cause cancer.
We've been hearing for years them trying to say that it causes lung cancer, and we say, really, that's interesting because you can't even show us one case of cancer being caused by cannabis use alone.
You definitely have to do it moderately because it does paralyze the cilia, but if it's not radioactive, you're probably not going to get cancer from it. Smoking it
can be harmful because of the proper use of smoke.
Not as a result of anything in the cannabis plant, but because they're intaking heated plant matter into their lungs.
People said, well, you don't know, we haven't been smoking it long enough. Look what happened with cigarettes. We've had about 4 decades, or more than 4 decades of experience. If this was going to show up, it should have shown up by now.
Finally, a study came out just in the last month verifying that cannabis smoke does not cause cancer. It's different than nicotine. And the elements in the tobacco smoke do cause cancer, and the elements in the marijuana don't.
There's no cases of marijuana-only smokers getting brown lung syndrome. There's no cases of marijuana-only smokers getting emphysema. Strange for a plant that's so dangerous. How come none of that?
Marijuana is as bad for you or worse than tobacco? Impossible. If they had the evidence, they'd be putting emaciated bodies or emphysema, lung cancer, black lungs, they would be parading them throughout the media. They don't have one. Yet people somehow or other think that it might cause the same thing.
In fact, if you look at the straight deaths from substances, a different type of picture starts to appear. The #1 killer in the country? It beat out AIDS, heroin, crack, cocaine, alcohol, car accidents, fire, and murder combined. Tobacco.
That's a nasty, dirty thing to say, son. A lovely, pure white cigarette causing cancer. It gets me right here.
With an average of 430,000 deaths per year, considering it's a #1 killer, it's interesting to know that tobacco receives government subsidies
and is grown with radioactive fertilizer.
Now get out there and sell cigarettes.
#2 on the list, if we don't include poor diet and physical inactivity, with well over 85,000 deaths a year, alcohol. As we look much further down the list, there are others that may surprise you. Caffeine comes in with 1 to 10,000 deaths a year. And some of our most popular pain relievers, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs such as aspirin, still make an appearance with over 7,500 deaths annually. Where does marijuana lie in this? What kind of staggering number do we find?
I don't know. 50,000? 250,000?
300,000?
For marijuana, I'd probably say then 80,000.
I would say it would be hundreds of billions.
Get ready for it. Here it comes.
There are no deaths from cannabis use anywhere. You can't find one.
In 10,000 years of known use of marijuana, there's never been a single death attributed to marijuana. There's 400,000 deaths in America alone every year that are directly attributed to tobacco.
I've heard that you have to smoke something like 15,000 joints in 20 minutes to get a toxic amount of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. I challenge anybody to do that.
And even in the animal studies where people have loaded the animals up with doses that would be hundreds of times what a human could possibly be exposed to, no, the animals don't die. The LD50 seems to be astronomical.
I mean, you can die from ingesting too much aspirin. You can die from ingesting too much coffee.
The drug warriors who say we have to protect society, save these people, are being just a little bit disingenuous.
Not one university or medical facility has ever recorded a single death directly attributed to marijuana. But never mind that. There's other problems, other reasons to fear it. Take addiction, for example. There are more kids in addiction clinics for marijuana than any other substance. This must mean that marijuana is the most addictive substance today.
It's undoubtedly true that there are more teenagers and kids in treatment for marijuana than all the other drugs combined. What the DEA never tells you is why that's true.
A kid is caught possessing or smoking marijuana. He's taken to court. He's given a choice. Either you some horrible penalty, or you go to a treatment center. Obviously chooses to go to treatment, and he goes to treatment there, he's considered an addict.
But then the DEA gets to point to that stat and say, look at all these kids in treatment for marijuana. God, it must be because today's marijuana is not the marijuana that your parents were smoking.
As far as I understand, only 3% of the people in treatment for marijuana are there voluntarily. The other 97% were told to by their guardian or told to by a judge. So you can choose between jail or treatment. And a lot of people choose treatment.
It provides no basis for speaking about addiction. Anybody who is at all sophisticated about marijuana would rate them the way two researchers were asked to rate drugs in order of addiction. Nicotine was 1, alcohol was 2, then heroin, then cocaine, then coffee, and then marijuana. There may have been a couple of other drugs, but marijuana was at the very bottom, below coffee.
This narcotic, unlike the opiates, the synthetics, and cocaine, is non-addictive.
What do you mean by non-addictive?
By non-addictive, it is meant that the user of marijuana, when deprived of the drug, will not experience the agonies of withdrawal. It is habituating, but its use can be discontinued.
Then what is its danger?
It's used as a scapegoat for covering up underlying problems in people, especially young people. Here I am, don't ignore me.
If you use marijuana on a daily basis for a year or so, and you stop using it, you're going to notice some differences, but nothing like the kind of withdrawal people will experience in withdrawing from either tobacco or heroin.
But why would the government and the DEA want to put a statistic like that out there? We'll learn more about that later. The gateway theory.
Is marijuana a gateway drug?
Yes, I think it is.
You haven't...
I don't exactly know why, but I know it is.
It opens a doorway to other drugs.
It makes you want to experience more.
It makes you feel good.
Yeah.
People want to experience something else and, you know, have a, I guess, more dreams.
Its greatest danger lies in the fact that it is a stepping stone to the harder drugs, such as morphine and heroin.
That's why there are people that want to legalize marijuana. They figure if they can get the young people in this country onto hard drugs, they can destroy your generation, or in this generation.
You know, in the days of Harry Anslinger, it was called the stepping stone hypothesis. If you stepped on this stone, marijuana, you were bound and determined to go on to the next stone, which would be one of the so-called hard drugs.
Every time it's been studied and looked at and so on, they have never, ever found that there's certainly nothing in marijuana that makes you want to go to anything else.
There is no inherent psychopharmacological property of the drug which pushes one toward another drug.
I'll smoke a joint. I want a bag of chips and fucking junk food. I don't want to go out and get ripped.
I drink alcohol. That's my drug of choice. It could be said I started on milk. I mean, this is crazy. If I use marijuana, why does that automatically make me a candidate to black tar heroin? It's a nonsensical argument.
In fact, only 1 out of every 104 marijuana users use cocaine, and less than 1 use heroin.
The black market throws the dealers of soft drugs together with the dealer of hard drugs.
So if you have a black market, and you have a dealer that's dealing in marijuana and LSD and everything else, and the dealer might say to you, hey, you want to try something stronger? Well, in that sense, because of the black market, because of prohibition, people may be more susceptible to seeing these other drugs and being willing to try these other drugs.
And so what you see is that there is a gateway effect, but it's a gateway effect caused by prohibition and the blending of the hard and soft drug markets.
Where does this leave us? Oh, wait. What about laziness? You will be useless to society if you use marijuana. But if that's true, well, there are about 50 million people who smoke marijuana in America, and over half of the Canadian population who've tried it. And yet, both societies seem to flourish. And just look who some of these people are.
Stephen Jobs developed Apple Computers smoking pot. Ted Turner developed CNN News smoking pot, still smokes a joint every day. You go through every musician you like, from the Rolling Stones to the Beatles to Led Zeppelin, they all smoke pot.
Snoop Dogg, Willie Nelson.
Come on, Bill Clinton, he didn't inhale, man. He didn't inhale. Don't be so naive.
Virtually every presidential candidate has now copped to using marijuana at some time in his or her life.
A few times in the Army, I tried marijuana. It was not a significant part of my life,
I had a senior law enforcement official tell me that in his judgment, up to a quarter of the White House staff when they first came in had used drugs in the last 4 or 5 years.
The people that have personality problems and the people that are going to be lazy and going to lose their job, they're going to lose their job anyway. They're not losing their job because of marijuana. That's just a lie.
I love Tommy Chong. I think that a lot of the Cheech and Chong episodes that people believed, not knowing that Tommy wrote and directed the movies, thinking that, you know, that's what a stupid stoner looks like. No, actually, that's what a really brilliant creative genius looks like, acting like somebody you think's a stoner.
And none of this is borne out in the research or when you look at people who are long-term users and happen to be lawyers, judges, doctors, and, you know, writers.
But what about the potency of the drug?
Marijuana is dangerous. There's higher THC levels than ever before.
Anytime you got a bag of Colombian dope 20 years ago, it was way better than the Mexican swag that you normally got. So there's always been a range of THC in plants, and the fact that we can now grow stuff that's equivalent of what Colombian was 20 years, well, it doesn't mean that we're boosting THC to unheard of levels. It just means, you know, hi, there are some nuances in this discussion that people should be aware of.
And I actually think that it's a real stroke of our own ego to think that for the 50 or so years of Prohibition that we've improved upon varieties that have been cultivated for drug use in places like India and such for thousands of years.
People say, well, you can abuse marijuana. Well, shit, you can abuse cheeseburgers, too. You know, you don't go around closing Burger King because you can abuse something. I can take a fucking fork and jam it in my eyeballs. That mean forks should be illegal? You know, I could jump off a bridge. Should we outlaw bridges? Let's nerf the world.
But what about all the crime and violence associated with marijuana?
From beat cop to police chief, I saw ample evidence of the harm caused by alcohol and the absence of evidence caused by marijuana use. And I mean the complete absence. I cannot recall a single case in which marijuana contributed to domestic violence, crimes of theft, and the like.
You want to know what a weed smoker looks like? You're staring at one. You know, like, I'm a weed smoker. I'm not, like, crazy or, you know, I'm not stabbing you right now.
Most of the violent crime that's committed, or most of the crime period that's committed or having to do with drugs, is people who are on drugs committing violent crimes. If you make it legal, if you make it cheaper, you make it more available, you're going to have more violence, more addiction,
Tom, that is
more
not
crime.
true. Stop lying to us.
Oh, now, come on.
Stop lying to us. That is not true. You know, don't tell me that. I've smoked pot, Tom.
But
I've admitted it. I've done it. I've done all of the big three. I've done tobacco, I've done alcohol, and I've done marijuana, Tom. Guess what? Marijuana's the least of the three, pal.
You guys proved me wrong or whatever. I want to hear someone that has smoked too much weed and went home and beat his wife and beat his children or whatever like you see on booze.
The only big issue on alcohol is drunken driving and binge drinking among college students. Otherwise, you can drink to your heart's content.
There are far more crimes committed under the influence of unadulterated, if you will, emotions. Anger, rage, jealousy.
A lot of our understanding is driven by what's in the paper and on the television and the radio these days, and we get extremes, and the black and white thinking is reinforced, I think, by that.
If only there was something to compare it to. Something that was prohibited at one time but is now regulated. So we could see what the difference might be. What could that be? What could that be?
Under prohibition of alcohol, everything got worse. Everything.
Alcohol prohibition really birthed and gave rise to massive organized criminal groups within the United States. It led to a general disregard for the law and a general disregard for police activity because it was a law that most people didn't obey.
Would you have supported the prohibition of alcohol 75 years ago?
Well, I'm glad you brought up the alcohol example. I mean, as a governor, you must have known firsthand the cost of alcohol. I hear this argument a lot of times, like alcohol.
That isn't what I asked you, Tom. I asked you a specific question. Don't give me spin. I said, would you have supported the prohibition of alcohol 75 years ago?
I don't think I would have.
Why?
Because alcohol, for better or worse, and a lot of times for worse, it's a close call, is a long entrenched and ingrained part of our culture and our society. I mean, you go back thousands of years, the first writing is about alcohol, the Bible, everything else. It's really hard to reach in
Tom, wait
and
a
pull
minute.
this out of society.
Let me inject something then if you believe that God also made the marijuana plant, didn't he?
I'm talking about our culture and our society.
You just said the Bible.
Alcohol poisoning went up by 600% during Prohibition. There were more speakeasies in large cities like New York City under Prohibition than there are taverns and liquor stores today.
Sure, one can point to alcohol as being a continuing social problem, but we don't have people shooting each other over alcohol.
When alcohol was prohibited, people lived at that time to know the difference between prohibition and non-prohibition. They could see that the prohibition of alcohol caused the emergence of gangsters and the underworld that took control of these substances. Alcohol then was no longer in their control.
Could this be the same for marijuana?
It strengthens organized crime, without a doubt, because you have to be a criminal to sell it. It's that simple.
This brings crime into it. That's why the benefits and the ability to make money is so huge in it.
Weapons were used to intimidate people, and we've seized approximately 50 weapons, sawed-off shotguns, and most of them are loaded.
Where's all this competition we've heard so much about? You call these prices low?
Marijuana is just a weed, and marijuana is worth more ounce for ounce than gold.
You don't find legal commodities, you know, at $200 an ounce. You don't even find them at $200 a pound. Heck, most things are $200 a ton for corn and grain and barley.
That's why when you walk 10 pounds of marijuana across the border into the United States, it becomes worth 20 pounds.
You create an artificially inflated value for that drug that is so huge that people decide it's worth murdering people in order to control this market.
I think the Fraser Institute called cannabis prohibition a gift of revenue to organized crime.
But what do growers and dealers think of this?
Would you like to see the government in the future legalize marijuana here in BC?
Stealing money from us?
I know I wouldn't like to see it legalized. The government would control and regulate the product, and that could potentially hurt a lot of people in the industry.
How can you compete with factories just have perfectly rolled out doobies? They'd perfect it, and we'd all be out of money.
It makes for strange bedfellows. You've got the police and the high-level drug dealers both agreeing that we should maintain this prohibition. Well, when you got high-level drug dealers saying prohibition is good, you might want to scratch your head a little and think, well, shoot, why would they want to continue prohibition?
I can't imagine why a grower who's making $150,000 or $300,000 a year would ever want to see marijuana legalized. I mean, the last thing a grower wants is sensible policy. The madness continues and they continue to get rich.
You know, Betty, I'm going to bring this up at the business meeting tomorrow.
You make the penalties stiffer? You know what? Good. For those people who are not getting caught, price goes up.
See, so not only do we allow them to tell us how much drugs are going to be supplied, the potency of those drugs, who they're going to sell to, where they're going to sell them, just to make sure they get it all right, we let them keep all the profits.
So you've got essentially a Wild West. You've got an unregulated market in which anything can happen. It certainly may work for things that people generally accept, but if you try to prohibit something that's in demand, that the people want, then it's pure folly.
And without control, it's hard to regulate areas of concern, like keeping it out of the hands of our children. There have been some studies that suggest heavy sustained long-term use from adolescence to adulthood has the potential to exacerbate symptoms of those with a genetic predisposition for schizophrenia. And although there is strong evidence that refutes this, it does lead one to question, could there be a better way of deterring children from using, rather than letting dealers decide what age is appropriate?
For the last 10 years, our children across the United States have said that it's easier to buy illegal drugs than it is to buy beer and cigarettes.
It's harder to get beer because you have to go through a regulated establishment that's going to check ID, that's going to have those safeguards in place, that isn't just going to sell it to you because you got 40 bucks in your pocket.
The guy down on the street corner, he doesn't want to know how old they are. You don't want to see an ID. He says, show me the money. And if they get the money, it doesn't matter if that child is 4 years old, they're going to get the dope.
If you can't control the sale of the product, how on earth are you going to keep it out of the hands of kids?
Could we be the creators of what we now see as some of our biggest problems? Have our solutions been prelude to our worst fears?
You know, the use of the criminal law for the basis of public health is a wholly bad idea, no matter how you cut it.
It doesn't work. You cannot legislate morality.
One person can say it's immoral to legalize it just as much as someone can say it's immoral not to legalize it. It doesn't get you anywhere. You have to have a rational policy debate by talking about the consequences.
Now, I've had young people tell me that, well, your generation had a martini and that was your crutch, and why can't we have our own kind of crutch? You know what? Why don't you be a generation that doesn't have to have any kind of crutch?
It's a lot easier argument. If you just say, oh, it's immoral, then you don't have to debate why it is that alcohol kills so many more people than marijuana, or why it is that tobacco takes 7 years off your life and we can't establish that marijuana does anything particularly.
If people do drugs and they commit crimes around those drugs, they should in fact be punished. But you can't punish someone for something that hurts no one.
We should legalize marijuana, tax the hell out of it, and put every dime back into the healthcare system.
Taxation and legalization? Doesn't that seem a little extreme? Wouldn't it be better to just decriminalize?
The distinction is simple. Legalization of marijuana makes it a product that is legally available to adults.
That doesn't mean that there's unregulated distribution, unregulated sale, and unregulated use.
The decriminalization of marijuana still makes it an offense. You're not going to go to jail for it under a decriminalized model, but society is still saying no, 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 no.
It doesn't address the problems of organized crime, and it doesn't create a situation where you have retail sales.
Decriminalization is just kind of a goofy concept. To say that it's legal to own something, to use it, to possess it, but not to produce it or sell it, just seems like this illogical position, because where did this stuff come from?
It's the worst of both worlds. Sends out an incredibly bad message. It should be controlled like alcohol, like tobacco.
The total impact for the U.S. budget from legalizing marijuana and taxing it at rates like alcohol and tobacco is somewhere in the $10 to $14 billion range. It can be used to pay for healthcare costs. It can be used to rebate to lower taxes and give people lower tax rates. It can be used for highways, for hospitals, for national defense. It's $14 billion and can be used for whatever its best use is.
The production or the harvesting, the packaging, the sales of marijuana could be handled essentially the way we handle alcohol. You sell to a kid, you sell to somebody under the influence, your license is in jeopardy. That license ought to be hard to get and easy to lose.
It seems to make sense. It's a little jarring, but nowhere are these issues more relevant than here in BC. Yes, marijuana is illegal here. And yes, police actively pursue growers and dealers. But that doesn't stop the market from thriving. It's believed that the illegal BC marijuana trade industry employs anywhere from 90 to 150,000 people. And the product is now known around the world. It's even been given its own name.
BC Bud.
Bud. BC Bud.
British Columbia Bud.
I don't know what you are meaning.
BC Bud?
BC Bud. You guys know what BC Bud is?
No.
You guys know where British Columbia is?
No. Isn't it in Britain?
No, it's in Canada.
When I say BC is famous for
Pot.
Weed and hippies.
Mountain, sea. Marijuana.
I used to think of the beachcombers back in the days, but now I just think of that BC Bud.
Do you know what BC Bud is?
No.
Oh, it's really well known. BC Bud is bud that comes from British Columbia, and that's why they call it BC Bud or Beasters. Dude, you got the Beasters? Yeah, I got the Beasters, which means you got bud from BC.
You know what the word grow up is?
I'd say it's pretty common knowledge here what a grow up is.
People do them in their houses or in their basements.
I'm surprised it's not in their dictionary. A grow up is something that happens inside somebody's house, like one of our friends or something, and they just grow weed inside of their house.
Do you know anybody that's growing marijuana?
I don't, well, no.
Kelowna, my hometown. With a population of only 100,000, Kelowna is said to house well over 1,000 grow-ups. A police officer stated in the local paper, if they were to bust one grow-up every day for a year, they would still be nowhere near getting rid of them. And Kelowna is not alone.
Where are they in BC? They're everywhere.
They're in every single corner of the province. There is no community in the province that doesn't have grows and hasn't had an increase in grows.
But the fact is that there's thousands and thousands and thousands of grow-ops all over British Columbia. And the most common thing you hear when they rate a grow-op is from the neighbors is, I had no idea they were growing pot on my street.
You know, if you actually took my estimates seriously, that there were 17,000 grow-ops in British Columbia in the year 2000, if you took that seriously, you're looking at roughly 1 out of every 100 dwelling units in British Columbia. We need to have a sense of that.
Not bad for a province with a population of only 4 million people.
It's certainly changed a great deal from the 70s and 80s when it was an import-export business to the domestic production business of the 90s and beyond.
That would make us Columbia North. We're talking a lot of production.
The reality is that there's a huge range of people involved in the marijuana industry in British Columbia. It's not a hierarchy. People don't beat you up if you go into the marijuana industry. It ranges from people growing a few plants to members of motorcycle clubs and others possibly being involved in the business.
Police at one time used to attend to every single call that came to their attention. Somebody would call and say, I think there's a grow. Police would do an investigation, do a full investigation. Well, that has dropped over 7 years to where it's only about half the time.
But it seems to me that if we look around and talk to people who are living in the real world, one of the things we discover is that we don't understand it very well. And when we see these numbers like 1% of all dwelling units potentially are involved in marijuana grow-ops, it certainly ought to give our politicians perspective on what it is they're trying to do.
So how does one find these grow-ops? For police, it involves the use of forward-looking infrared cameras that can detect the above-normal heat radiating from a grow-op, or the sniff test. But if all else fails, this, Grow Watch. Communities have become so flooded with grow-ops in BC that some neighborhoods have started their own watch programs. This one, set up by the Chilliwack RCMP, even has an education package with phases: training, neighborhood cooperation, certification. Once certified, you are able to hang this sign which shows that you are a neighborhood that does not approve of marijuana grow operations. There are questions provided to citizens in order to aid them in identifying a grow-op. Questions like, do the residents keep to themselves? Was the sound of construction heard coming from the basement soon after occupants took over the residence? Is there condensation visible on the windows? Is the yard unkept? The education package does state that a positive response to one or some of these questions does not necessarily indicate that the residents are involved in criminal activity. Maybe that's a good thing.
But why is it that grow-ops are popping up in virtually every neighborhood of BC? How much money can actually be made by simply growing some plants in your basement? And what do these grow-ops look like anyway? We finally got a grower. Right now we're driving to meet them. It's around 8 lights. It's not a huge show. This is what they use for clippers and stuff like that. When they hire clippers to do a show, you put these on, and if people are looking from the outside, it just looks pretty much like you're wearing sunglasses. But when you're on, I mean, I can't put them on right now because I'm driving, won't be able to see. This is everyone's getting glasses, director, other producer. Where's my phone? We just wait for the phone call, so we'll keep in line for when this comes to.